California's Central Valley is both the stronghold of industrial agriculture and the cradle of a rural resistance movement that is happening right now as we speak. Our guest today is Daniel O'Connell, Executive Director of the Central Valley Partnership, which is a regional nonprofit organization and a progressive network of labor unions, environmental organizations, and community groups that spans the San Joaquin Valley. His recent book, In the Struggle, Scholars and the Fight Against Industrial Agribusiness in California, is, well, about exactly what the title tells you it's about, the fight against industrial agribusiness and the role of scholars in the fight against the powerful. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us here today.
It's an honor and a privilege to be here to tell this story.
Well, first, can we talk about what big agriculture has generally been up to? I know your book goes back quite a few decades in history, and also what they are up to right now that is of major concern.
So the book delineates a history, a geography across time. And so to understand the problem of industrial agriculture, and what I mean by that is the consolidation of land ownership and monopolized economy. So things that progressives fought against 100 years ago, that is, you watch over time in the book, over 100 years, how industrial agribusiness garners our public subsidy. So we were just witnessing folks speaking about the Green New Deal and the subsidies. Why are we subsidizing our own oppression, subjugation, and the ruination of our environment? Why aren't funds going to our working folks, to farm workers, who are the real farmers in this economy, protecting them rather than putting them at risk? Why are the poorest people paying the most to drink polluted water, whereas the good water, the clean water, is going to the wealthiest few individuals, and that's happened, that subsidy over a century. And finally, it's the great subsidy of research and our public institutions like the University of California and the federal government and state government of California itself that fomented and catalyzed and then sustained this system that is acting like a cancer on our rural communities and destroying our environment.
What is the main concern around big agriculture today? What are they doing right now? That's the most important thing we should look out for as their, as you called it, dehumanizing and destructive agenda moves forward.
So I think that there's three aspects that come forward, and it depends. The book is going to mean certain things for different people. Certainly, we have a new climate normal in the West, where you have extraordinary droughts happening in succession. I think that we're not going back, and we will see how this evolves. But in another year of drought, following a 500-year drought recently, this is going to be devastating. You know, we have an issue where we have unregulated groundwater. The most wealthy and largest entities can put their straw on the ground the farthest and the deepest and suck the aquifer down. So we have a situation where the largest lake west of the Mississippi is now experiencing the most extreme land subsidence. And if you are a rural small farmer or a resident in an unincorporated area, you have a 30-foot well, and next to you is an agribusiness with a 1,000-foot well drawing up all the water. You have to put in a new well for $30,000 that comes out of your own pocket. So the drought is going to be a case that this is going to be front and center. It's going to be a terrible, terrible time for everyone. Farm workers need work on those big farms, and that puts food on their table. So, but we have to ask in a broader structural way who gets subsidized. Secondly, you have labor. The San Joaquin Valley, we imported labor. First of all, the racialized context of our labor force going back to the alien land laws and the importation of labor from Asia, from Japan, from China, from the Philippines is there in our history. Extraordinary racism in California in the 1870s. Then moving forward, we had the importation of labor from Mexico historically, and the federal subsidy of that program, starting in World War II to the early 1960s, of the Braceros program. This was federally subsidized. University of California made decisions on where that labor should go. So, and then finally, the research itself that mechanized agriculture, driving a lot of small farmers that aren't capitalized out of business and driving a lot of farm workers out of work as well. Those three are the biggest issues that'll come forward. But I would argue the larger one, the one that Dorothea Lange and Paul Taylor and many people fought for, was against latifundia, against this erosion of democracy, and for an agrarian democracy where the cultivators of the land are also the owners of the land. That we have lost. And I would argue what started in California later polluted Texas and Florida, and now the entire Midwest by the 1980s on is experiencing the same sort of economy and loss of democracy that's happened in California.
When people think of California from other parts of the United States, they think of a leftist paradise. How is it that the state can have such a reputation for progressivism in certain areas and still be allowing this kind of, abuse and destructiveness to happen?
The dominant cultural narrative of the globe is coming out of Los Angeles and the Bay Area. And that subsumes this other history of the real California, I would say, of the Central Valley, where grounded, very practical, extraordinarily diverse communities, many of them who experienced genocide, like the Armenians or the Hmong who experienced war and civil war. We have an enormous, rich array of indigenous folks, some of whom are from Oaxaca and Mexico, many from still here. So the California is two stories. One, interior and rural, extraordinarily reactionary, structured to be oppressive on racial lines. Historically, seriously, structured, and this delineation goes through the book. It shows you how it was structured to be oppressive along racial lines. That is happening. And the question I have for you and for other Californians is, how do those Bay Area folks that are doing so well and are progressive, how are they tolerating this? 4 hours away, you have a fourth world economy that is being tolerated. The abuse of people who can't vote, who are laboring to put inexpensive food on your table. We need the assistance. I will say that the state government and the movement in the state, its progressive movements, are enabling us to register more people to vote, to engage. There is a movement that is active, intersectional, multiracial that's happening now, and we're getting assistance as well.
Talk about the role scholars are playing in this fight.
So scholars are a uniquely trained vocation, or you would say. Though in our book, only 4 of the scholars are campus-based, and the title of the book, In the Struggle, orients scholars and universities to put their resources and their bodies where the problems exist. If you're too far from a problem, you end up producing speculation or conjecture. You can immediately solve a problem if you're engaged directly in it. However, it pulls you away from the credentialing and the tenure and the publications and the rewards of the university is based on. So there's a tension here in who is and what is a scholar. Scholars are uniquely trained to produce knowledge. And
actually, I loved your book because it reminded me that I myself am a scholar, even if I'm not at the university anymore. I was like, great, I like this guy. He classifies me properly.
The book is oriented towards students because I think students have more power than they know to demand of their faculty and universities a more responsive, or if you will, taken from the 70s and 60s, a relevant education. In an era of climate change, we must put our resources, our bodies, our knowledge production within the context of problems like the San Joaquin Valley. Because if we can solve the problems of the San Joaquin Valley, we can impact the problems of the Midwest and potentially areas in other places that have this problem, such as in Brazil or India and other places that are experiencing industrialized agriculture.
In your book, you profile several scholars who have been involved, and each story is fascinating. Can you talk about some of the most surprising things you came across in your research?
So the book lays out a narrative of 100 years, but it's broken up into 8 discrete chapters that are their own entities and stories. And so you have Paul Taylor and Dorothea Lange in the middle of the Depression, not only in California, but predominantly so, beginning this fight and beginning to understand this evolution of a neo-feudal economy, or this consolidation that Paul Taylor, coming from the Midwest, didn't like. Oh, the hook story that opens the book that most people that are scholars, especially sociologists, will orient to is the famous Arvin-Dainuba study that a 1902 reclamation law. Remember, 1902, the middle of the progressive era. That law should have delivered that public water from the Central Valley Project to small farmers who lived on the farms. The research comparing Arvin and Dainuba showed that Dainuba, surrounded by small farms, had better civic and economic and social outcomes than Arvin. And yet immediately it was suppressed. It was censored immediately by the federal government who funded it, and then censored, a second study censored and not permitted to move forward for another 30 years when it was done at UC Davis by Dean McCannell. And one of the other really shocking stories is the political pressure that agribusiness and large growers put on the production of knowledge. And I think that illustrates another level of validity of the findings, both the empirical, statistical findings and the scientific outcomes that they analyzed and wrote about. Then you have in front of that, now we have the backstory, which I sometimes say that this book is like Chinatown on steroids. If you will see the corruption on a federal level and a state level and within major corporations weighing in and against local communities and farmers and farm workers.
What kind of dangers did the scholars encounter?
So a famous story that when I sat down in Saul's Delicatessen with Dean and Juliet McCannell, and they told me a story of John Harris, who is a cattle baron of sorts here in the Valley, and the chancellor of UC Davis sitting them down and saying, there is a high probability if you take a plane ride, John Harris wouldn't bat an eye to waste a pilot in a plane to get you. He ended up going down to the Valley in any case, where he thinks there was an attempt to poison him and intimidate him and to pay him off.
And so, for people who don't know these figures of history, talk about what he was doing that would have upset the industrial agribusiness.
So the creation of the Central Valley Project, the building of dams in the Sierra Nevada, most of the water in California is in the mountains and held in snow. It was dammed, and a system of canals, first federally funded, was put into place. That was the research Goldschmidt did. The final segment of that construction was done in the 1960s on the west side of the valley. The west side of the San Joaquin Valley has the largest agribusinesses. And the same government analysis was done, except with a higher scientific rigor of regression statistical analysis, was done by Dean McCannell at UC Davis, funded by the state government of California, to determine if the Goldschmidt findings that small farms are better for an economy and a society than large agribusinesses was true. And as his findings came forward, they were dramatically true, overwhelmingly true. And again, we have not a censorship by the US government, though that findings was dispersed in the government reports to make them not as accessible. But what happens then is you see the threats of agribusiness at UC Davis to pull their money out of the school and to try to influence research and the researchers themselves. So Dean McCannell's life was threatened, and he was pure intimidation was occurring, and many other shenanigans that are delineated in the book.
Can you talk about what the study found, both historically and again, if you can bring it up to today, the difference in towns where folks worked in agribusiness versus towns where folks worked in more smaller enterprises?
So they basically let's go back to Goldschmidt. He quantified certain things of a town. How many schools? Was it incorporated or unincorporated? What was the retail sales in the economy? That was a huge one. The small businesses around the small farmers were acting and are entrepreneurs. They spent their money in town, whereas the large-scale agribusinesses lived in urban centers, sometimes New York. The capital flew out of the economy. And when it did, it's like cutting off an arm. You want capital to circulate many times in the economy before it goes out. Agribusinesses sell their walnuts and almonds to China. The water and all of the resources are lost, and the profits are accrued outside of the region. So small farms are an invigoration of a local economy, but you can quantify this in other ways. How many doctors? How many teachers live in the area? What is the percentage of poverty? How many people live in the area? Metrics on PTAs, numbers of diversity of churches, numbers of taxis, numbers of hospitals. These are all ways to quantify both the economic and civic outcomes. Those were done first in a case study done by surveys in the 1940s by Walter Goldschmidt, again, censored and suppressed. 30 years later, UC Davis, and funding from the federal government, again, funds McCannell. And he not only does it for 83 communities using regression statistics, then he does it across the Sunbelt states of the United States and finds similar outcomes. And he also focuses some of his research on an extraordinary problem, the west side of the San Joaquin Valley. So he does it in a higher threshold of rigor and in broader scope, and his findings were even more extraordinary than Walter Goldschmidt's.
Can you talk about, I mean, people are talking about a move to small farming, a move to organic farming, a move to local farming as we face this enormous problem of global climate catastrophe. Can you talk about what you see as the future of agriculture?
So within an era of economic and global climate crisis, producing both energy and food, and they're both measured in calories, are extraordinarily important. So to produce food is an empowering act. And to fund, I think that we need to look at multiple structures, not only small farmers. I think cooperative farms, land trusts, the creation of food commons, vertically integrating along a value chain for not profit extraction solely, but for economic and environmental outcomes. These are all things that are within our purview, and integrating affordable housing onto these land holdings, especially around the urban, semi-peri-urban area of an urban area, to produce food, to teach science, to talk about stewardship, to ground values, to increase habitat, to create agroecological systems and practices, to foster multiracial community, intergenerational productions. This is all here, and it's happening mostly within urban areas that don't have many access to much good soil, but nearby urban areas, where and how can we get urbanized folks, especially the young, out on farms, learning, building a new culture around food in the country. It's already happening, actually, just invigorating it. And those subsidies that the Green New Deal is proposing should go to those young folks from communities of color that want to do this. They are willing to do this, already doing it, but without funding and capital. And we need to help them also in doing training around business, accounting, and things like that.
Daniel O'Connell, what is your hope for this book?
You know, one is, I start with a saying, Isao Fujimoto said, if you don't know what story you're in, how are you going to know where you are? And so I find, as I've witnessed the country drift away, rural America, into terrible narratives, blaming immigrants for our problems, the entire Midwest, which was once so progressive, now so reactionary. I want people to relearn a story of democracy, that economic equity is a basis for a stable democracy. And then for us to confront, again, the long legacy of racialized oppression that has started and founded the country, and to begin to continue to punch at it, and for multiracial networks to problem solve together. The book ends with Janaki Jagannath talking, and we titled that Cultivate Diversity. White folks need to step back and be more humble and contribute still, and we all need to link arms and work together in an existential crisis that's confronting us. I have enormous hopes, and I think the San Joaquin Valley, where these problems first presented themselves, we have multiracial, intergenerational, gender-inclusive mobilizations in the middle of the belly of the beast, and it's happening, and we're taking ground, and we're winning. So if we're doing it here, almost on our own, well, maybe this model of what we're doing here, this intersectional organizing, can be uploaded to other communities, especially those ones where the communities of color and the oppressed are most are living, and we need to send our resources and to help out most.
Daniel O'Connell, Executive Director of the Central Valley Partnership. Your new book, In the Struggle, Scholars and the Fight Against Industrial Agribusiness in California. I thank you for coming on our program tonight.
Keep up the fight.